When I first started really diving into D&D, my DM at the time was really itching to run two other systems, Call of Cthulhu and Vampire the Masquerade. Because they're both horror games, the players at our table at the time weren't really interested in playing them. But I kept them both in the back of my head for when eventually I'd have an opportunity. And thanks to Humble Bundle, which is not the sponsor to this video, it's just a cool platform I like shouting out, I was able to get my hands on some cheap PDFs of both of these games. Now, I already talked about Call of Cthulhu in the video, which I'll link in the description below, and I had a lot of fun with that system. And I was actually a little more excited to sink my teeth into Vampire because of some of the praise that I've heard over time. My actual experience has been a little more mixed than what I would have hoped for. But what it did do was clarify for me a little more about why D&D is most people's first TTRPG, and also why they tend to stick with it instead of branching out to other systems. Don't worry, this is still a review, mostly about Vampire, and I have a lot of positive things to say, but like living, or I guess unliving with vampirism, it's complicated. Hi, I'm John, this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today we're going over my first impressions having played Vampire the Masquerade. Let's get into it. Vampire the Masquerade is a TTRPG where each player roleplays a vampire trying to hide their vampirism in modern times, hence the Masquerade. Each vampire belongs to one of several clans, which each embody a kind of vampire archetype, from the more outwardly monstrous to the more elegant and refined. The game has been around since 1991. And unlike D&D, which at one point branched into several different settings, Vampire has really been building on its main lore this whole time. Save for a 4th edition, which everyone seems to really dislike. Which brings me to my first disclaimer. The version of Vampire that I played was 5th edition, released in 2018. Now, when my DM was itching to play Vampire, he definitely wasn't talking about this version, as it hadn't even been released yet. From what I've gleaned from some surface level research, 5th edition is actually kind of controversial, in that it streamlines a lot of mechanics, but really focuses its gameplay on kind of street level encounters, where vampires are powerful, but can also be taken out by a mob of humans that know their weaknesses. I guess in earlier editions of Vampire, kind of like D&D, you'd span more from being a neonet all the way to a vampire elder, where the scale could literally be world domination or something like it. Because of this, a lot of longtime Vampire fans prefer what's called V20, or the 20th Anniversary Edition. V20 was not in the Humble Bundle I picked up, so I went with the one that seemed more beginner friendly, at least according to some opinions on Reddit. Which should make my second disclaimer fairly obvious. I am a complete noob when it comes to World of Darkness, the storyteller system, or the lore of Vampire the Masquerade. I talked to a few different game masters I knew that were familiar with the system, but mostly that had to do with the fact that there was a lot of story and lore. And we touched on some mechanics like hunger and willpower, but overall, I didn't really feel that helped me ease into the mechanics of the system. And by the end of my first playtest, I really felt like I was missing something, which I'll get into in a bit. That being said, I really do forgive myself for this, as something the game masters did mention is that this book is not very well organized. Vampire is what I'd call a top-down design, meaning that there is a strong narrative that the game is trying to tell, and the mechanics are kind of designed to fit that. Now, you may say that's kind of like all TTRPGs, but as a counterexample, I think D&D is a good example of a bottom-up design. There is no default setting in the D&D player's handbook. It's really just a collection of player options and game mechanics. And it's putting some onus on you, the dungeon master, to use the tools in the player's handbook to create your own fantasy world or storyline, with the players basically agreeing to use the options presented in that book in order to interact with whatever world you create. In other words, the game is easier to balance, at least mechanically, but the story isn't going to be as fully formed as something like Vampire or even Call of Cthulhu. In fact, even the hunger mechanic was one I actually discovered after starting my playtest, because not only was there a whole character creation section in between two sections of general rules, but there were definitely times I would be reading a paragraph that I thought was mostly lore, only for it to end with a sentence that had pretty significant rules implications. Now, say what you want about D&D 2024, that game has awesome layout and graphical design. So, it is completely possible that there are entire mechanics that I'm missing that would really change my opinion on this system. If you're familiar with Vampire, please educate me in the comments below, and if you do so respectfully, color in a little dot to your humanity tracker. Third disclaimer, I did not play this game with a bunch of other players at a live table with a knowledgeable GM. I used a pretty niche solo journaling method, which I detailed in my video, Journal Gaming. So far, with every other game I've playtested this way, I have found success really getting a taste for what the game is trying to do, and the kind of tables I think would be most happy playing it. Vampire has been the first where I've experienced some hiccups, and maybe having an experienced storyteller would help, but there have also been times I've had experienced GMs try to introduce me to a system, and due to their personal preferences or style, there have been times I've walked away from a game still not really understanding its pros or cons. So know that my review or impressions or whatever of this game are done with this unique method that I find gives me time to really try to analyze the design. And for Vampire, I still have a lot of questions I haven't been able to find satisfactory answers for. Last disclaimer is a content warning. So Vampire is a horror game with pretty graphic artwork and very unafraid to explore some pretty mature themes. In fact, I'm pretty sure in the core rulebook, it does compare a game of Vampire to creating like an HBO show. So think Game of Thrones level of content. However, it is different in how a game like Call of Cthulhu delivers its horror. For example, in Call of Cthulhu, you're playing a normal person that's confronted by eldritch abominations or supernatural elements that can corrupt their psyche or at least leave some trauma. In an interview that I watched with creative director Mike Mason, he even mentions that the fun of Call of Cthulhu is separating yourself as the player from the experience of the character. You're not getting frightened as much as there's a catharsis in experiencing playing a separate entity being frightened. Vampire very explicitly tells you that you are role-playing a monster, that at best you will have to make some morally gray decisions, and you may make some downright evil ones that disturb you. Now, in terms of this channel's mission, discovering your best self through gaming, I think that if you approach this game mindfully, even when you make evil decisions, you're learning a lot about yourself. If you're really uncomfortable with the direction that a story takes, it's kind of confirming that you're a good person. And I absolutely wouldn't blame anyone that was really uncomfortable playing a game like this. It really isn't for everyone. And as you saw from the thumbnail, I really do think it speaks to kind of edgy theater kids. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it isn't gonna be a light, fun-hearted experience like many D&D games I've been a part of. Now, I can also imagine some tables where some of the players are just a little too enthusiastic to be evil. So if you're a game master or a storyteller and you're thinking about starting a game of Vampire, I would just pick your coterie with care. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's actually dive into some of the game's mechanics. Vampire the Masquerade is actually part of this larger connected universe called the World of Darkness. And I'm pretty sure all of those different games, including Hunter the Reckoning and Werewolf the Apocalypse, all run what's called the storyteller system, which might have some unique mechanics based on the individual characters that you're playing. For example, vampires having a hunger tracker. Now, in the storyteller system, you have various characteristics and skills, each which have a value of 0 to 5. When you're asked for a roll, however many dots you have of those different characteristics, you add to a pool of d10s. You roll all those d10s. For every one that's a 6 or higher, that's a success. And if you have more successes than the difficulty of the test, you succeed. If you don't, you fail. For example, let's say you're asked to roll a strength athletics test. If you have a strength of 3 and an athletics of 3, you roll 6 d10s, you count up the number of successes, and if you meet or beat the difficulty, then you succeed. Conceptually, I love this system, especially for a game where the focus is more on immersion in the fiction than it is about, say, tactical decision making like D&D or Pathfinder. You get to have all the fun of rolling a bunch of dice without the arithmetic that can slow the game down. Like Call of Cthulhu, it also makes conflicts really easy to resolve. If you have a contested roll, both players roll the appropriate pool, and whichever one has more successes comes out on top. So the way criticals work, if you roll your pool, for every pair of 10s that you roll, that is a critical success, and it counts as 4 successes instead of 2. You can also win at a cost. If you fail a test, but you roll at least 1 success, you can still succeed, but maybe there's some kind of drawback or complication. At least the game can keep moving, in theory. And of course, if you roll no successes at all, your attempt is a total failure. Which brings us to willpower. In Vampire, there are really 2 kinds of health trackers. Health, which is your physical well-being. If you take damage, that would go to health. Willpower is more your emotional constitution. So if you go to roll a pool and you really need to succeed, you can spend one of your points of willpower to re-roll up to 3 of your dice, basically pushing extra hard to try to succeed when you need to. That being said, there may also be social scenes that act as a kind of combat, except instead of trading punches, kicks, or knife slashes, you might be trading insults or trying to politically maneuver yourself in a formal situation. If someone humiliates you or one-ups you, instead of taking health damage, you may take willpower damage. Now, from my time in 5e hearing about other systems, I've often heard that other systems structure social interaction in a different way that makes it more interesting, and I gotta say, I do love this system for just portraying the emotional stakes inside of a high-pressure social situation. It also means that the system rewards building characters that are built to be more social than fighters. It's a common complaint I see in D&D. Pretty much every class has to be a combat class because that's where the rules are pointing them to, which isn't totally wrong. If you had a character that was completely inept in combat, they probably wouldn't be very fun to play in D&D. But in Vampire, you might have a character that can just talk themselves out of situations, or open up your crew of vampires to be able to enter social circles they wouldn't normally be able to. Kind of like how Inara helped the crew of the Serenity on Firefly. Now, there is a third tracker that embodies the vampire experience called Hunger. At the beginning of each night, each vampire starts with a hunger of 1. When you roll your dice pool for a test, you have to replace a number of your d10s with hunger dice, d10s of a different color equal to your hunger level. Now, these hunger dice can't be re-rolled with willpower, and if you roll a 10 on any of them, you get a messy critical, which means you succeed, but you kind of overdo it. Like, if you're trying to open a locked door and you try to break the lock, maybe you accidentally rip the whole door off its hinges, threatening to breach the Masquerade and reveal yourself as a vampire. Now, if you fail and get a 1 on your hunger die, well, that's a bestial failure. That's where you might either lose control of your character or your hunger increases. Basically, it's up to you and the storyteller to decide the complication earned by that bestial failure. And so, if you try to be a moral vampire, maybe you only drink from animals or drink bagged blood, you know, the kind of stuff you see on Vampire Diaries. Well, at best, you'll only be able to reduce your hunger to 1. To be able to reduce your hunger all the way to 0, you do need to feed on somebody and totally drain all their blood and kill them, which is where some of the moral grayness comes from. In terms of the game's progression, there aren't levels like in D&D or Pathfinder. But if you do this forbidden act where you drain another vampire that's stronger than you, you may be able to increase the potency of your blood, which makes you stronger in terms of being a vampire, but it does mean that some of the ways that you may be able to skirt around feeding on people, well, they just won't work anymore. So there's always this interesting balance of, do you want to keep your humanity? How does that balance with your blood potency? And are you able to keep up the masquerade of being a human? All in all, I really love this system, which is why, as we start getting into my experience, I just think there's something I'm either missing or, well, let's just get into it. Okay, so when I play a new system, rather than trying anything homebrew, what I like to do is find a well-reviewed, pre-made adventure by the system's publisher to really get the closest experience to what their intended design is. And I also like to run it through with a pre-made character, again provided by the designer. Now, in my niche solo journaling method, if I can help it, I like to focus the story on only one of these player characters, just so that I'm not splitting my attention too finely. In Call of Cthulhu, it ended up working really well, and in the part of the story where I might need a second or a third player character, I was able to basically take a side character or an NPC, build player character stats for them, and have them tag along. That was my plan for Vampire as well. In this instance, I ended up getting the book Let the Streets Run Red, which was included in the Humble Bundle. The first adventure, Power Prey, was highly recommended as a straightforward, beginner-friendly adventure. In the back of that book are also pre-made characters, and knowing this is a story-focused game, I picked the character that I thought would have the most interesting story to explore, which led me to Benny Martinez. So from here on out, spoiler warning for any content in Let the Streets Run Red. To get to some of my concluding thoughts, skip to the timecode below. Benny Martinez is a former art prodigy who was knowingly being groomed to become a vampire by the Toreador clan, which are kind of like the divas in the Vampire the Masquerade world. However, before he was embraced, Benny started dating this girl he had a crush on in art school, who ended up being a vampire from Clan Tremere, who are the blood sorcerers. And one night, she embraced him without his knowledge so that they could keep dating forever, but he was so furious that he broke up with her. Now, her identity isn't ever really established beyond this backstory given, so I decided to name her Jessica, and she ends up being a pretty crucial character in the way I ran Power Prey. Now again, I chose this storyline because a lot of folks on the internet said it was straightforward and beginner friendly. And from my experience, it just didn't feel like Benny, however he was supposed to be built, matched the mechanics that were in the scenario. For example, Benny is definitely more of a social build. He has a charisma of 4, a manipulation of 3, and a composure of 2. Although he has 3s in performance and streetwise, throughout the scenario, the only social tests he was asked to do were manipulation, persuasion, often at difficulty 4, which was his entire dice pool, which meant to succeed, he needed to succeed every one of those d10s, including a hunger die. And here's the thing, it almost never did. And again, this is when it was a social roll. And there is a ton of combat in the adventure. There are 4 encounters, and Benny has absolutely no proficiency with unarmed, melee, or firearms. And so, with really poor physical stats, no skills in them, and with the scenario making it pretty clear there wasn't really talking the aggressors down as an option, Benny just did not seem built for this scenario. And there didn't really seem to be something that matched the way that he was built. That being said, he was definitely built for his story. He had like 4 points in painting, but it felt like playing a D&D character, like building a rogue that had expertise in crafting tools, charisma as the highest score, and no weapons to equip that would trigger sneak attack. Like story-wise, I get what they were going for, but like D&D, apparently the system values certain characteristics and skills more than others. And the thing I found so frustrating is that the scenario seemed to expect a certain outcome, but didn't point to how that was supposed to happen. So, for example, in one of the first fights, there are these security guards that are just normal people. One of them has a gun, the other just have clubs or whatever. And they're like, you're a vampire. These are normal people. They shouldn't really be a threat. Okay, well they have 6 dice in their pool for physical encounters, and Benny has 1. I don't know if there's supposed to be like a discipline or some other mechanic I'm supposed to know about. I know that as a vampire, Benny doesn't really take aggravated damage from any of the weapons they have, but still, they're gonna wear him down over time. And the location he was trying to get into was literally gatekept. There was a gate keeping him out. And you either needed to be good at athletics to jump over the fence, at larceny to pick the lock, or to use a vampire discipline he didn't have access to like vampire leap over the gate or something. Maybe it's disciplines I was missing. I mean, Benny had a few of them. One of them was a taste for blood, which I'm pretty sure is like for tracking. One of them is for awe, which is like, you know, he's so handsome that he can succeed better at social situations with mortals. And one of them is extinguish vitae, which is very specifically like an anti-vampire ability, which is too bad we're only dealing with mortals in this scenario. So again, if you're familiar with vampire, and there's some mechanic about how, as a vampire, I'm supposed to just be stronger than these mortals, I was missing it. I couldn't find it in the conflict rules or anything. Thankfully, this didn't really create any hiccups in the story, at least from my perspective. Basically, anytime there was something where it's like, oh man, you're in a fight, as a vampire, you're supposed to win. I basically had Jessica, who was tagging along the whole time, just show up, do some vampire stuff, take care of the humans, and then move on to the next thing. If it said you should be able to break through this gate, I didn't create character stats for Jessica. I just hand waved it and was like, Jessica does a vampire thing and breaks the gate. Now, I already complained about the layout a little bit, but I will say, even in this scenario, there were just some weird errors. Like, there was a part where they talked about excavation sides instead of excavation sites, or parking sports instead of parking spots. Like, it just felt like either there wasn't an editor or the editor just wasn't very good at their job. So again, I came to Vampire really wanting to love the system. And I think if I had maybe an experienced GM blatantly tell me, these are the characteristics that are going to matter, these are ones that don't, maybe I would have had more fun with it. But at the end of the day, with the pre-made character and the scenario, it just felt like Benny wasn't very useful at anything. And if I was a player at a live table with this experience, boy, I would have been kind of grumpy about it. I've been there too. I've been at tables where my character just underperforms because I had a lack of knowledge of what the system valued. And those were some of the games I disliked the most. That being said, this could totally just have to do with this product. This one adventure could just be a little too specific to incorporate the specific talents of this one pre-made character from the same book, but it did leave a bad taste in my mouth. And it may be that other storytellers that run Vampire do a better job of trying to get different characteristics or skills in the game more often. Okay, one last note, and this is more of a philosophical take than anything specific. As I've done more research branching out into different systems than D&D, one thing I do find pretty often is, I don't know why people cling to D&D, all these other systems are so great. Which, I can understand their frustration. There are a lot of great systems out there that I think a lot of people would have fun with. And I do think it does a disservice to the hobby as a whole to dismiss acknowledging the fact that some of these systems take a lot of work to get into. Now, I'm not saying D&D is a rules light game, but if you were a new DM and you just wanted to run a one-shot for the first time, really, the prep you would need is to pick a monster or design some kind of combat encounter, give it a fun location, and give the characters a reason to go after and fight it. Oh no, the blacksmith's daughter got kidnapped. Oh no, a monster is eating the crops and needs to be destroyed. And especially for low-level player characters, yeah, there might be some mechanical crunch, but the experience should really be roll a d20, add some stuff, you're in combat, roll initiative, action, bonus action, movement, hit the thing, it dies, good for you. Ultimately, I do think there isn't very high a barrier to entry to kinda at least get started. And there is a depth of content that keeps players and DMs anticipating to play more. DMs have an entire manual of monsters that they can open, and can look forward to looking at higher challenge rating creatures to pit against their players. Players can get excited about the things that they get at the next level, and look forward to what spells they get to pick, or look forward to using a cool new weapon mastery. You get the idea. For more top-down games like Call of Cthulhu or Vampire the Masquerade, first of all, you kind of need to be on board with the kind of story they want to tell in the first place. Hence why my GM at the time had a hard time getting a group together. Second, everything is dependent on the player's engagement in the story. Because the rules are a little lighter, or at least progression is a little lighter, from my experience, there isn't as much on that front for them to look forward to, other than to see what's going to happen in the story. So if for whatever reason they aren't engaged in the story, then it's going to be harder for those games to keep up momentum. And as a probably moderately skilled game master myself, I found that there was just a lot of work to do to even get me started in some of these systems. For Call of Cthulhu, after I tinkered with the D100 roll under system a little bit, I felt pretty confident resolving checks. I mean, to really understand it, I had to read a good deal of the Call of Cthulhu core rulebook. I read some of Lovecraft's original fiction and really read up on some of his philosophy to try to get into his mindset so that the story would align with something that he would actually write. For Vampire the Masquerade, a lot of its lore is incredibly dense, and like the rules, not the best organized in the 5th edition core rulebook. So I really felt like Charlie in that meme with the red threads, trying to put together who the Camarilla are, who the Anarchs are, what the clans are all about, where my character might sit in relation to all of them. I felt like I needed to know the wider world to give context to just this adventure. And that's all to say, in some of these more story-rich games, I feel like for a GM, the barrier to entry is a little higher, which again makes you really excited to actually play it because you've invested a lot of time learning it, but it is a lot of time, and it is a little more niche. It's not like a light pickup game that you can do like D&D. Really, I think the point I'm trying to get across is just because a game has less rules doesn't mean that it's easier to get into. I think it's a little more complicated than that. So in conclusion, Vampire the Masquerade, I think, has actually a pretty solid core system that I happen to have a poor first experience with. I do think if an experienced GM or storyteller ran it for me, I probably would have had a better first experience, but I do think that speaks more to the organization and layout of the content of the core rulebook than it necessarily says as a criticism of the unique method I've decided to use to playtest these games. All that being said, I can see how, for some people, Vampire the Masquerade is like the perfect TTRPG for them. They're probably gonna lean into having more edgy preferences, they're probably gonna gravitate more toward the theater kid approach, embodying the character and all the drama loaded with being a vampire. And I do think that you are really gonna need to set some boundaries to make sure that the game isn't uncomfortable for anyone. Because boy, are there some things that the book mentions where I'm like, I'm not sure I would want to play this game with my mom. I think Vampire is really best for players that enjoy diving into the deep psychology of their characters, exploring content that's dark without relishing in it, and are okay with their characters being punished if it's most exciting for the story. I would pass on Vampire if you're uncomfortable with really dark content, if you aren't interested in really dense lore, or you hate losing control of your character, which is definitely possible with bestial failures or having your hunger get too high. The reason the people that love Vampire really love Vampire is it perfectly delivers what they love out of TTRPGs. And I think that this ultimately is a niche subset of players, as opposed to everyone at large. Okay, having played a pair of horror games, which are similar in that they are kind of lighter on the mechanics, heavier into the story elements, I think I want to revisit a game that I've tried, but never really finished a formal playtest of in this way, which is D&D's crunchier cousin, Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Until then, have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.